We're about to dive into the dark and unsettling reality of the economic cycle, a cycle that is wrought with the clenching grip of debt and credit. Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates, one of the world's largest hedge funds, will reveal dire consequences of this unrelenting cycle and how it may affect you. As we plunge into this topic, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell for more updates on the world of finance.
The way the system works is if you give a lot of money in credit and you make it cheap enough, they will spend it. Okay, but when you create debt, it's stimulative over the short run and depressing over the long run. Because when you have to pay it back, then you have to earn more than you spend to pay it back. So what do you do with that debt? Okay, if you make it tough to pay it back, then what happens is you have an economic downturn. If you make it easy, you print the money. And that's the cycle. So when we look at what the Fed has done, the Fed and the government together gave an enormous amount of debt and credit and created a lurch forward, a giant lurch forward, and created a bubble, okay? And now they're putting on the brakes. Okay, so now we're going to create a giant lurch backward, I think, because it's simple. The amount of, we talk about inflation. Inflation is a very simple thing. It's the amount of money that's spent, money and credit spent, divided by the quantity sold is the price. And so if you take that money away, then you can't get rid of inflation. The way you get rid of inflation is to get people to spend less. And that is what an economic downturn. So the cycle goes like that, and then when you get to the point where, let's say, the economic pain is greater than the inflation pain, then you see them do the opposite. So we're going through that particular cycle. So it's, I think, a delusion to believe that, okay, what they're going to do is deal with inflation, and it'll all go away because they'll deal with inflation by doing that without realizing what that means in terms of that, what that means of buying power. Think about the supply-demand of bonds, just to give you, we have to sell debt. Well, the government is going to borrow, central government's going to borrow about 5% of GDP, so they have to sell bonds in that amount. The Federal Reserve is going to sell, or however run off the balance sheet, about 5% of GDP. That's 10% of GDP. Okay. Who's going to buy the bonds? Who's going to buy that? Oh, now they don't want to buy the bonds. We've had, pension funds, others, they don't want to buy that bonds. Foreigners don't want to buy the bonds. So then the way that works is interest rates have got to go up to a level that constricts private credit demand. And when that happens, then there's less spending. That's the mechanics. So there's that trade-off. And I think we're going to be in an environment in which they're trying to navigate these two difficult, you don't want too much inflation and you don't want too weak an economy. And so they're trying to navigate that, which will be probably something like the 70s. And that's all happening in the context of the political conflict, which is very important, right, and the international conflict.
Dalio explains how debt and credit are essential parts of the economic cycle. When the government makes it easy to borrow, people spend more money, and the economy grows. However, this growth is temporary and creates problems in the long run when the debt has to be repaid. So there's a cycle of growth and contraction based on how much credit and debt the government allows.
The key, of course, is to try to get the balance as best as we can. I call it a beautiful deleveraging. You need a beautiful deleveraging. In history, debts decline relative to incomes. So you could go back and see the mechanics of that. And the way that happens is a mix of some amount of restructuring debts, and that is a deflationary force because one man's debts are another man's assets. And so some amount of restructuring is a deflationary force. You take buying power away from others. And then some form of debt monetization. and to get the stimulation. And they tried to get the middle ground. Because of the size of the issues we're dealing with, it's not something that we're used to in terms of its magnitude, I think. So, and then if we take the internal conflict factor, I think we have to look at all three because they play a role. And so it's traditionally, those three things are the perfect storm, right? They all affect each other. So if you have a bad economic situation, as you said, it affects one group of people and it hurts them, then you have an internal political conflict, right? The left and the right, the rich and the poor, and so on. And then that affects things, and vice versa. And then, of course, the external conflict, the cost of the external conflict. Like, for example, it's estimated that so far, the cost to the Ukraine war, of the Ukraine war to NATO, is something like $8 trillion. If you look at to rebuild, are we going to rebuild? Are they going to rebuild? They ask the NATO countries like they ask the European countries. Are you going to put in? Well, they're broke, and they're going to put in. Then if you look at the cost of climate change, climate change is approximately $10 trillion a year. If you look at the cost of building infrastructure, if you look at the cost of all of those costs and you add up those costs, it's not like we're going to stop the spending. So you have to achieve that financial balance in some kind of a way. Right now, governments are like people, meaning when you spend, you think, the basic economics works the same. The only difference is they get to print money. So when you spend, you think, how much money do I have to spend? And then wherefore, what do I prioritize it on? Governor Lamont has that challenge. We all have that challenge, not the federal government. So what happens is the government says, what do we need to spend money on? And they then go spend the money, and we don't have that balance. So that issue is a big fundamental issue, particularly when we have populism on both sides.
Dalio explains that the solution to the debt problem is a beautiful deleveraging. This means reducing the amount of debt relative to income through a mix of debt restructuring and debt monetization. Debt monetization involves the government printing money to pay off its debts. This reduces the value of the currency, which in turn brings down inflation. The economic cycle is a complicated process that's influenced by debt, credit, and government policy. As Ray Dalio explains, the solution is finding a balance between stimulating economic growth and controlling inflation. It's essential to understand the mechanics of this process to make informed decisions about investments and financial planning. How will this cycle affect your portfolio? Does Ray's insights change your strategy? We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. If this video gave you value in any way, please click the like button and consider subscribing for more videos on the world of finance and the economy.